Welcome everyone. We're gonna look at how does one approach narrow complex tachycardias on a 12-lead ECG. So to avoid this being a very long video, I'm just gonna divide it into different parts. So this is just part one of this video series. And I have to say, I think SVTs are, I think they are one of my favorites. I just love the mechanisms behind SVTs, you know, the concepts that are involved. So I hope I do a good job explaining this to you. Now, before we get to that, I think let us first look at a more general way of classifying tachycardias when you see them on an ECG, and the different differential diagnoses that we can find. Now, we can classify these tachycardias based on the actual rhythm itself, whether it's a regular rhythm or an irregular rhythm. And then we can go further and then look at the width of our QRS complex. So we can have regular narrow complex tachycardias, irregular narrow complex tachycardias, and then regular and irregular wide complex tachycardias. Now, looking at narrow complex regular tachycardias, there we have things like sinus tachycardia, which is really easy to look at, to diagnose, I think. Atrial flutter, or we can have AV junctional reentrant tachycardias, for instance, your AV nodal reentrant tachycardia, or AVNRT in short, or we can have our atrioventricular reentrant tachycardia, or AVRT. We have things like atrial tachycardia, like your focal atrial tachycardias. And we can have junctional ectopic tachycardia. And then looking at our irregular narrow QRS complex tachycardias, the most common one being atrial fibrillation. We can also have atrial flutter or atrial tachycardia, but conducting with variable AV block. Now, the AV block may be a physiological thing, because remember that the AV node, in terms of physiology, it's designed in such a way that it has a property that we call decremental conduction. I suppose it's a protective mechanism for the ventricles, because imagine if a patient has AF and every single fibrillatory wave from the atrium gets conducted to the ventricles. That would be pretty dangerous, don't you think? Because it means that it would predispose the patient to also developing ventricular fibrillation. So because the AV node is able to then block fast rhythms, because it becomes refractory, that's why you can have that variable physiological block, which is what contributes to the irregularity of the rhythm. And then we can have multifocal atrial tachycardias under this group as well. And then with regular wide complex tachycardias, number one on the list is our famous ventricular tachycardia, especially monomorphic VT. That's the one that's usually pretty regular. You can also have an SVT, a supraventricular tachycardia, but that's conducting with the bundle branch block. So the bundle branch block, part of it is what contributes to the wideness of the QRS complex. Now, this bundle branch block, it may be a pre-existing bundle branch block, or it can also be rate related. Or you can have antidromic AVRT. Now, that's when we are dealing with accessory pathways. So in that case, oh, that's a pretty ugly heart. In that case, let's say, for example, a patient has a left lateral accessory pathway right there. And then that's our AV node. So what happens is that with antidromic AVRT, because it's a wide complex tachycardia, what you have is that you're going to have antegrade conduction down the accessory pathway, which then pre-excites the ventricles, thus giving you a wide complex, right? Because you're getting pre-excitation. And then retrograde conduction up the AV node. And then you get this reentrant circuit forming there. Now, the reason why it's wide is simply because you have pre-excitation right there. Or we can have a pre-excited SVT where you have, let's say, an atrial tachycardia with a bystander accessory pathway. So you are not getting a reentrant tachycardia per se, but because you have a bystander accessory pathway, when that atrial tachycardia starts, it may conduct down the accessory pathway and therefore pre-excite the ventricles. And then you can have paced rhythm. Now there's something that we call pacemaker mediated tachycardia. So you can have a wide complex because it's paced, and then it's usually regular. And then the irregular wide complex tachycardias would include AF, which contributes to the irregularity, and then conducting with the bundle branch block, which contributes to the wideness of the tachycardia. Or you can have flutter with variable block, conducting with bundle branch block, or pre-excited AF, which is very dangerous, by the way, and polymorphic VT. So for the purpose of this talk, though, we're only going to focus on narrow complex tachycardias. So let's say now you're presented with an ECG and you have a narrow complex regular, or rather you have a narrow complex tachycardia. So the first thing that you need to ask yourself, the first and foremost is my rhythm regular, or what's my rhythm? So if it's a regular rhythm, so you now have to go and look for atrial activity, because it can really provide you with some useful information as to what is happening. So if there are visible P waves, if you have identified atrial activity, you then need to determine the relationship of that atrial activity to the ventricular activity. So you're first going to look at the atrial rate relative to the ventricular rate. So you need to ask yourself, is my atrial rate faster than my ventricular rate? In simpler terms, do I have more P waves on the ECG than QRS complexes? So if that's the case, then your differentials would be along the lines of atrial flutter, or you might be dealing with a focal atrial tachycardia, and rarely that would be AV-nRT, because usually with AV-nRT you have one-to-one A to V relationship. Now, the important thing here, the important distinction that you have to make, especially regarding flutter and atrial tachycardia. So with flutter, you remember that we have these sawtooth pattern, right? This sawtooth pattern, that would be your atrial activity. But with the focal atrial tachycardia, you have your P waves there. So the difference, the main difference here is that with flutter, you don't have an isoelectric line, whereas with focal atrial tachycardia, that's your atrial activity, and then you have an isoelectric line, atrial activity, isoelectric line, isoelectric line. You see that? Whereas with flutter, you don't, because it's a continuous reentrant tachycardia, thereby giving you this wavy looking pattern. whereas this is a focus that keeps firing. So it's important to make that distinction. So if in a case where your atrial activity is not faster than the ventricular activity, you then need to reverse the question and then ask yourself, is my ventricular rate greater than or faster than my atrial rate instead? Of which in that case, you then have to consider these differentials. You might be dealing with a high septal VT because it's coming from high up top, it then conducts downwards. So it sort of presents with a relatively narrow QRS complex. Or maybe you might be dealing with a junctional ectopic tachycardia, or rarely an AVNRT, or even your nodoventricular or fascicular nodal reentrant tachyarrhythmias. But what if, yes, I'm able to see my P waves, but none of this? What if I have a 1:1 relationship, my 1:1 A to V relationship? What then? So in a case like that, then you've got to go further and look at something that we call the RP interval. So if you haven't heard of that, an RP interval is simply an interval where you take you take it from the R wave to the beginning of the P wave during the tachycardia. And then if your RP interval is short relative to the PR interval, then we call that a short RP tachycardia. But if your RP interval is long relative to your PR interval, that's a long RP tachycardia. And that's going to help you also to make some differential diagnoses. For instance, if you have a short RP tachycardia, meaning that you have an RP interval shorter than the PR interval, and your RP interval when you measure it is less than 90 milliseconds. So the 90, there isn't really much strong data to support that, but it's a value that we use. But there's, if you were to take the patient to the EP lab and do some pacing and measurements, we usually take a V to A time of less than 70 milliseconds. That one is strongly documented. But the RP interval of less than 90 milliseconds is also, that's what's being used. So if this is the case, then most likely you are dealing with a typical AVNRT, but you might also be having a focal atrial tachycardia or a junctional ectopic tachycardia with 1:1 retrograde conduction, or rarely AVRT. And I'm saying rarely because it's very rare for it to have such a short RP interval or RP time. Now, this is gonna, let's make some sense out of this. So in normal sinus rhythm, so this is your atrial side, this is your AV node, and then your His. Now, in sinus rhythm, first of all, you have what we call a fast pathway and a slow pathway and fast pathway. No? So in sinus rhythm, we have an impulse coming down, conducts down both the fast pathway and the slow pathway. But because the fast pathway conducts faster, obviously, the impulse gets to the His and activates the ventricles much faster, such that by the time this impulse comes here, it blocks, right? Because this one is already conducted down here. So this is what happens in normal sinus rhythm. Ooh, that's an ugly QRS. But anyway, that's what happens. And what we need to be mindful of, or what we need to remember, is that the fast pathway has a long refractory period. The slow pathway has a shorter refractory period. Okay, keep that in mind. Now, what happens then is that if you get an ectopic beat, a premature atrial complex, it comes down. So let's say that's your PAC. It tries to conduct down the fast pathway, but the fast pathway has just previously conducted a sinus beat, right? So it hasn't completely recovered from its refractory period, because we said the fast pathway has a long refractory period. So when this premature atrial complex tries to conduct down the fast pathway, it blocks. And then instead, it only conducts down the slow pathway, which is why you get a bit of a pause or a long PR interval, and then it conducts down the ventricles to give you a QRS complex. But because we have slow conduction here, as this impulse is traveling down the slow pathway, it's actually giving time for the fast pathway to also recover from its refractoriness. Yeah? So that by the time it gets here, the fast pathway is already ready to accept another impulse, of which this same impulse then conducts again retrogradely and activates the atria retrogradely, which is what gives you a retrograde P wave right over there at the edge of the QRS complex, which is why then you get such a very, very short RP time. And this you see with typical AVNRT. So typical AVNRT is called a slow fast AVNRT. Slow fast AVNRT. And the reason why it's called a slow fast AVNRT is because you have antegrade conduction down the slow pathway and then retrograde conduction up the fast pathway, which causes simultaneous activation of the A and the V, right? Now, clinically, usually they say you get what they call like a frog sign, because the patient gets this pulsation up their neck because the atria and ventricles are contracting at the same time against closed AV valves, right? So that's what gives you that neck pulsation. So that's why with typical AVNRT is number one on the list, because it usually has a very, very short RP time. But it's rare with AVRT, because with AVRT, let's say for instance, you have an accessory pathway, and then you have, let's say you have antegrade conduction down there. For a narrow complex tachycardia, you have antegrade conduction down the AV node and retrograde conduction up the accessory pathway and activates the atria retrogradely. So down the AV node, you get a QRS complex up the accessory pathway retrogradely to activate the atria again, and you have a retrograde P wave over there and your T wave. So you get a bit of a longer RP time compared to what you would see with typical AVNRT. Right. So next, if you have a short RP interval, short in a sense that the RP interval is still shorter than the PR interval, even though the RP interval is more than 90 milliseconds. So now in your differentials, you may have the most likely being orthodromic AVRT, which is this. So orthodromic AVRT is where you have an accessory pathway, but it doesn't conduct antegradely. You don't get pre-excitation, but rather it has retrograde conduction properties. So instead, your antegrade limb becomes your AV node, of which the impulses will then conduct down the normal conduction system, thereby giving you a narrow complex tachycardia, right? But because you have a bit of a bigger circuit compared to AV-NRT, which happens here, you have a bit of a longer RP interval, more than 90 milliseconds. Or you can have atypical AV-NRT, or it might also be a focal atrial tachycardia. Or you can have a long RP tachycardia, where the RP interval is more than 90 milliseconds, way more than 90 milliseconds, and it's even longer than the PR interval. So in that case, then you might be dealing with a focal atrial tachycardia. AVRT also still might be possible, and atypical AV-NRT. Cool. Now, if you've been paying attention, you realize that we got all the way here simply because we were able to identify P waves on an ECG. But what if when we see the ECG, we have a narrow complex tachycardia, regular tachycardia, but we are unable to identify P waves? So as per the guidelines, it is said that if there are no visible P waves, then your differentials become these ones here. Could be typical AV-NRT, because you have such a short RP time. Sometimes the P waves become embedded into the QRS complex such that you can't even see them. So that's why it's also important to have the ECG in sinus rhythm, so that you can compare your QRS morphologies, because you'd find that you have some notches which are suspicious of P waves, but you can't be sure until you compare your ECG with your normal sinus rhythm ECG. Cool. And then you will also notice that this is all regular narrow complex tachycardias. So what if our rhythm is irregular? Now, if it's irregular, then we go the route of AF. Could be a focal atrial tachycardia or an atrial flutter that is conducting with a variable block, be it physiological block or maybe a pre-existing AV block, or it could be a multifocal atrial tachycardia. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where I'm gonna leave it off, and then we will continue with the rest of the talk on the next session. Thank you very much for your time.